Assalamu alaikum and welcome to lecture number 6 of Requirement Engineering CSE305. And today's lecture we are going to talk about particularly about requirements elicitation process. But before we get to it, we'll also briefly talk about what is a process, and taking that process definition into account, we are going to talk about requirements inception process or initiation process, which is a really small process, but we're going to talk about it as well. But the main content of the lecture would be requirements elicitation process. But before we get to it, let's quickly recap what we did in our previous lectures. In fact, this is recap of our last 3 lectures, because we were briefly talking about or discussing what is a requirements engineering process, and we said that there are 7 distinct tasks in a requirement engineering process. But if you guys remember from from my previous lecture, that I said that these tasks are not really small, and they are processes on its own. For example, inception is a whole process on its own, and so is elicitation and elaboration, and so we are going to talk about now in coming lectures about them in lots more detail. But few things which I think I would keep on reminding you throughout this course is that when we talk about these set of tasks in a requirement engineering process, then one thing that you should keep in mind is that these are not sequential tasks. So we may start inception, and at the same time we might be doing elicitation. Similarly, we might be doing elaboration along with elicitation, and we might move to negotiation, and we might also start specifying few of the requirements which we have already elaborated and negotiated and we have already analyzed. So these things, these tasks, although this diagram may look slightly sequential to you, but it's not. These activities, they can occur in parallel. And what was Inception about? If you guys, let's briefly recap. Inception was about getting to know your client, identifying stakeholders, and establishing the effectiveness of the communication process. And what was elicitation about? Elicitation was to understand the scope of the product, to get requirements or elicit or ask customers specific questions about what they want in the software they want to you to produce. Similarly, elaboration or analysis is about understanding or analyzing the requirements that you have already gathered in the elicitation phase. And we said that there are different ways and different techniques of conducting all these processes, for example, and elicitation, elaboration, and then we moved to negotiation. Negotiation was about reconciling requirements, coming to a consensus where every stakeholder, the client, you as a software development team, and all the other stakeholders, they're all satisfied with it. And then comes specification, where we start documenting requirements, where we start writing requirements. And we said there are different ways and different formats and different templates of specifying requirements, but each organization should customize their own template. And then is the validation part, which is really important for this overall requirement engineering process. And then the final process, which was requirements management. And something very interesting about requirements management task, which we discussed in our lecture, was that this is one requirement task which stays active throughout the software development life cycle, unless and until we baseline the requirement. Even then it's active. So for example, if you guys remember, then we drew a diagram like this, where we said that that if, let's say, this is the timeline of the project, where this is the time on this axis, and this is, let's say, the project finishes on time t, then requirement management would be active throughout. Because what requirement management is about, it is about identifying, it is about controlling changes and managing requirements overall. And there are lots of things that come out of requirement management, but one of the most important things are the requirement traceability tables or requirement traceability matrices, which are used to trace requirements, which are used to trace the changes in the requirements, and they're used to analyze the impact of those changes on the overall product. So this is what we did in our last 3 lectures. And as I said, that these tasks, they are not simple tasks, they are processes, and they are combination of other small activities. And there are different ways of doing these processes. So in our lectures from now on, we are going to talk about all of these processes one by one. So starting with, but before we get to it, so in today's lecture in particular we are going to talk about the inception process, and we'll start our discussion on elicitation process. But before we get to it, something very important which I want to share with you guys, that what is the process. I think we talked about it very briefly, but a very simple definition of a process is that if we just imagine that process is this big box, and we say, okay, this is a process, then one thing that a process would always do is it would take some inputs and it would produce some outputs. So these outputs can be more than one, and similarly the inputs can be more than one. I would say there can be n inputs and m outputs, anything like that. But normally a process would have some inputs and it would process them in some fashion, and so it produces some outputs. And if we open this box, then what's inside this box is actually some list of activities or tasks that are done. So let's say we say that if we expand this box, then this box looks something like this. We have smaller activities in it. So we have 3 small activities and they occur in this fashion, and there is another activity. It also takes inputs from that, and then it produces those outputs. So one thing that we need to keep in our mind, that all of these activities, so this process definition can be applied to an activity. So an activity, what is an activity? An activity also has this produce and consume relationship. An activity would produce an output, but in order to produce this particular output, it would consume something. Okay. For example, my activity is to conduct an interview, okay, or finally ask questions in an interview. Then what would be my input to this activity would be the questionnaire or my list of questions that I'm going to talk about in the interview, and the output would be the answered question that I will get out of the interview, or the way I prescribe it. So basically each activity has this produce and consume relationship. So when we do an activity, we may produce a work product or we may change another activity. Okay, so our process definition that it takes some inputs and it produces some outputs. But if we expand this process box, then we actually see that there are lots of small activities which can be done to actually produce that desired output. Now if we keep this definition of process in our mind, and if we look at now all those processes that we are going to discuss today, for example the inception process, then what would be inception about? That, for example, remember the process definition. So our process definition says that it's a box which has some inputs and it produces some outputs. Now if you keep this definition in mind, then inception would be nothing more but, so inception is a process, and we already know what are the inputs, what are the outputs that we desire from the inception process. So for example, what are the things that we desire from the inception process is we want to identify the stakeholders, we want to identify the objectives or goals that client has, and we also want to establish the communication process effectiveness. Okay. So these are broadly the things that we want to achieve, or these are the outputs that we desire from the inception process. So we want to identify our stakeholders, and within stakeholders we want to achieve multiple things. For example, within stakeholders we want to know that who was the original requester of this particular product, and then we also want to know who are the key stakeholders that we should keep in our mind when we are gathering requirements from this particular client. Then we also want to know what are the objectives and goals that the client has in his or her mind when they are asking us to make this particular product. And similarly, what are the economic benefits? And overall, we want to know what is the effectiveness of the communication process. Now we know that these are the outputs that we desire from this inception process. So what are the inputs to the inception process? So before we formally go and start talking to the clients about and start the formal requirements engineering process, what do we have beforehand. So for different kinds of project, we might have different kinds of information. For example, we might have some initial RFP document. For example, the client said, gave us a request for proposal document. Okay. Now, what is a request for proposal document? For example, it's if whenever a client is looking for example, a client wants to build a software house, and they are looking for lots of software houses who are capable of doing it. So what they would do, they would publish a RFP, and all the interested parties would, after reading the request for proposal, they would actually submit their bids. So a request for proposal is a journal document which indicates a client's desire to get something, and it is basically they are requesting that all the companies they submit their proposals. Now, what does this RFP include? Apart from the necessary information regarding the submission of the proposals, it also includes some background and some information about the software that they want to produce. Okay, so what essentially I am saying here is that before you go and start this inception process, you would have some information in your hands. You would know the background, that you would know to some extent that that who actually wants this and what do they want, and this is not the only input that you take in the inception process. So these are two possible inputs to our inception process. So these are basically these inputs to my inception process. But these are not the only things that you would have in your hand. For example, let's say that this is a university who wants a learning management system. Okay, now there are lots of learning management systems which are already out there. So what you would want to do is, whoever you are going to send for this inception process, you would want those people to be fully equipped with all the information or all the expected features or all the things that are there in a learning management system. And the reason is that you are not going to basically start eliciting requirements at this stage, but you want to have your own, you want to be fully aware of what are the things that are there in an LMS, and you want to know that what kind of people use an LMS, because one of the things that we want to achieve is we want to identify the stakeholders. Okay, and you want to know a brief you want to have a brief overview. Okay, what would be the kind of pricing that we would be quoting and things like that. So essentially some background and any other thing that would give you some insight into the client and into who is the requester of the project and how much money they can actually spend on this project. All those things, they are inputs to this inception process. Now, if you guys remember, then while we were discussing multiple tasks of requirement engineering process in our previous lectures, when we did inception, we specifically said that inception is a relatively simple task, and it consists of just a set of questions. So essentially there is no specific technique for inception. As we will see about the rest of the processes, for example, when we move to the elicitation process, then you guys would see that when it comes to eliciting requirements, then there are different techniques that we can deploy to elicit requirements. Whereas when we talk about inception, then it's a relatively simple activity or it's a relatively simple process. And there are not too many different techniques which can be used for this inception process, because all we have to do is we have to basically go and break the ice with the client. Okay, but the important thing is that how we conduct it and who and what kind of people we actually send to meet the client. So this is actually the important bit. So ideally, you want to send people who are good in building relationships with the people. Okay, and you want to send people who are good in breaking the ice, who are good in communication, and you want to know the background of the client, and you want to send somebody who actually is of the similar background, so that they can relate. And you want to send in maybe a domain expert, so that somebody who goes into a completely new domain, then he would not know what kind of questions to ask, and he would not know what are the key people in this particular environment. For example, I will tell you a small example from my own experience that we once did a construction industry project, and I've been involved in lots of ERP projects, and we used to do for manufacturing companies. But the first project that we did for a construction company was we literally had no idea what are the processes involved in construction. So when we went for our first meeting with the client, and we wanted to actually understand that what do they want, and how much money they are going to spend on it, and who are the key people whom we are going to talk in the next few days to elicit requirements. So what we did was we basically looked for a consultant. And we through some references, we came to know that a friend of ours, he's in the construction business for a number of years now, and we talked to him, and we actually asked him to come along with us. So although this guy, he did not have lots of IT experience, or in fact he didn't have any IT experience, but he gave us lots of useful input. And we basically were able to prepare some questions based on his knowledge, and having him alongside was also helpful, because when the construction guys, they were telling us that that the construction process is normally very streamlined, and the first thing that they do when they are constructing a big building is they dig the ground, and then they level the ground, and then then they lay the foundation, and then the flooring is done, and these kind of things. So he already knew about all these processes, and he also knew that specifically in Pakistan, normally the payments to all the contractors are done on Thursdays. So he also knew these kind of things, which were kind of very nice, because when we were talking to them, then we had somebody with us who actually knew all those things. And he was also suggesting some things to them, and the client, they were actually acknowledging them. So it's always a good idea to have people alongside you who actually know the process, and because. But the important thing is that you are not going to ask too many questions, because you are not eliciting requirements that what do they want in their final enterprise resource planning software implementation, but you just want to get a feeling that what is the importance of this particular project for them, and how badly they want it, and who are the people who actually want it. So as I said, that Inception is just about asking few questions, and you need to keep in your mind that what are the things that we want to achieve from this Inception process. And if you keep these things in mind, that we want to identify the stakeholders, we want to identify what are the economic benefit that they desire from this, what are their main objectives and goals behind it, and finally you want to analyze that how effective was your communication, and whether you were able to connect with the client or not. And it's just that you need to ask those questions in a friendly fashion, in a fashion that the client actually thinks that you know what you are talking about. Okay, so that is it from our discussion about the Inception process, and let's move on to the elicitation process, and let's see what elicitation is about. And when we talk about the process as a whole, then what elicitation process, what do we do in it? Yeah, but before, actually something very important which just popped in my mind is that in general, as I said, I think in one of the lectures, that in process, we normally say, in process improvement, we normally say that all the processes, they are wrong. Okay, and why we say that all processes are wrong? Because if a process exists, you cannot adopt that process as it is in your organization. Okay. So as I said, that there are some set of questions defined for the Inception process, but as an organization, and depending on your context, you are going to change that process. You are going to change that process so that it suits your particular scenario. So it suits your particular context. For example, you are going for, as I gave the example of the construction industry. So we took people along with us who had construction experience. If we go to manufacturing, then we want to have people with us who know the overall manufacturing process. And if we move to any other industry, we want to have people with us who know which are the guys who are important, and which kind of stakeholders we want to actually talk to. So as I said, that all the processes are wrong, but some are useful. So useful bit is that every process is useful to some extent, because it gives you an idea that how and what are the things that you want to do in it. It's just that you need to adapt it according to your particular context, and keep this thing in mind about process. Keep the process definition in mind, and keep this thing about processes in mind, that we do not adopt the process as it is. So there are no generic set of questions which you should ask to every client, because I remember that when I taught the software engineering course, then a couple of my students, they said, okay, no sir, we want to do a project for an industry, and they went to a client, and the client was not very knowledgeable, and they started asking questions straight from the Pressman book about requirement elicitation. Now I'm not saying that requirement elicitation questions which are given, or in the inception questions which are given in Pressman are wrong, they're absolutely fine. But they needed to actually connect with the client first, and the client was totally ignorant about what computer science is about and how to build softwares, and what is elicitation and what are requirements. He did not know anything about it. He just said tell me what I should have in my software. So he just wanted to know that what they can offer him. Instead, when they started asking him questions, and then those students came back to me and said, we were not able to get anything. And the client said, okay, show me something. So then they basically moved. Okay, then they basically decided that, okay, we're going to make a small prototype and give him some suggestions. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that no process is perfect. You need to adapt it according to your particular context. Okay, let's move to requirements elicitation. So requirements elicitation is the usual name given to activities involved in discovering the requirements of the system. Now we are already familiar with requirement engineering task, but when we say process, so we already know that what is a process. It's a set of activities where we know they are going to produce some inputs, and finally we are going to have some output because we want to achieve certain thing. And that particular thing in case of requirement elicitation is that we want to discover the requirements. So we want to basically get these requirements. System developers and engineers work with the customers and end users to find out about the problem to be solved, the system services, the required performance of the system, hardware constraints, and so on. So basically any sort of requirement that you can get from the client, whether it's a service that they want in the system or whether it's a constraint that they want or that they want to have on their system, you need to identify it. And it's not only the engineers, it's developers, they work with the end users and they try to identify all these things. And this whole requirement elicitation process, it doesn't just involve asking people what they want. It requires a careful analysis of the organization, the application domain, and business processes where the system will be used. So you not only try to identify what are the services that the end user would want in the system, you also want to build your understanding about the processes. That how, for example, we can get the registration requirements from, for example, students of a university or from the administration of the university, but we also want to see how their registration process actually works, because we want to put all those services in order, the way their process is. So, for example, let's say the registration has, these three activities, A, B, and C. Now, if the client wants these features to be done, then we can basically implement these three features, but we also want to know that what are the prereqs of which. For example, B cannot be done until A is done. Okay. For example, a student cannot select a course until it is offered. So this is very important. So A should be done first, then B, and then C. So we also need to develop an understanding how the process actually works. So we identify the services and the constraints, and we also try to gain our understanding about how a process actually works in the organization. So we have briefly seen what requirement elicitation process is. So keeping in mind our process definition, so let's say this is the elicitation process, and we now know what are the outputs that we basically want from this elicitation process. So we said that we want to identify requirements, and when we talk about requirements, then what are requirements? They are basically all the services that the client would want in the product, or any constraints. So this was the definition of requirement that we discussed in our first lecture. Okay, and not only we want the requirements from this elicitation process, we also want to gain understanding about the processes. So we also want to know how the processes actually work in the organization. So process of the organization. So example was, as I said, that there can be lots of registration requirements, but we also want to know how the registration actually works in a particular university. So these are the two key outputs that we desire from this elicitation process. And what do we have available to us as inputs? So all the information that we have gathered from the inception process, all these things, they are input to the elicitation process. So for example, we have identified key stakeholders. So they are input to this elicitation process, the list of key stakeholders. Similarly, we have identified what are the main goals and objectives. So we can basically tailor our elicitation process according to what are the goal and objectives of the client are. And we also know that we also know what is the main economic, or who is the main requester of this particular product. So we can maybe go and first talk to them. So all the things that we gathered from the inception process, they are all input to the elicitation process, and we know the output of the elicitation process. But now what we want to know is that what are the main activities or what are the main tasks involved within this elicitation process, and are there any techniques or are there any proposed formation of those tasks that if we conduct these things in this such and such order, then we will be able to gather better requirements. We will be able to gain a good understanding about the processes in a particular organization. So what are the different components of the requirements elicitation process? This diagram actually tells us lots of things. It actually says us that there are two things which it's actually telling us, that when we are trying to elicit requirements, then we try to gain the understanding of the particular application domain. We also want to know what are the problems that need to be solved. We want to know what is the business context. The business context means that what is the importance of this particular product, in terms of the business, whatever client is doing. And we also want to know are there any particular stakeholder needs, or are there any constraints which the stakeholder wants to put on it. And it says that this is a cyclic process, so we will just keep on doing it until we have these four components. So mainly we want to achieve these four things, but we want to gain understanding of the application domain, we want to know what problem needs to be solved, we want to understand the stakeholder needs and constraints, and we want to know in which business context this solution is to be deployed. And so these are the elicitation activities. So number one is we have application domain understanding. Okay, and they are basically driven from those four components of the elicitation process. So when we say application domain understanding, what do we mean? Application domain knowledge is knowledge of the general area where the system is applied. For example, to understand the requirements for a railway signaling system, you must have background knowledge about the operation of railways and the physical characteristics of trains. So if you are in process of making this railway signaling system, for example, you tell you want to gain understanding that how these operations actually work in railways, and and you also want to know physical characteristics of the system. You want to know the dimensions and where these signals are deployed, and you want to know the physical characteristics of the train and all those things. So, and as I gave you an example earlier about the construction industry, that if you're going to implement a project for a client in a new industry and you don't have any experience of that, then you need to have people alongside you who are actually going to guide you through this elicitation and inception process, because their knowledge is very, very important. So you want to develop the application domain understanding, and you do some things, you would perform some activities which actually help you doing it. Then the next is problem understanding. The details of the specific customer problem where the system will be applied must be understood. And similarly, going back to this railway signaling system, you must know the way in which speed limits are applied to particular track segments. So, our signaling system would be about that, for example, you have, let's say we have, this is our railway track, and, we want to know that, this is the patch where some speed limit applies. Okay. And trains need to reduce their speed, for example, from 70 miles per hour to, I don't know, 40 miles per hour. Okay. Now, here, or, somewhere here, you need to put a signal and saying that, okay, you need to reduce your speeds. So important thing is that when we talk about problem understanding, we already have gained some knowledge about this particular application domain. We have gained knowledge about, how these signals work and what are the dimensions of trains, and, where are the tracks and these things. But now we want to know, okay, what is the problem? Okay, why do we need signals? So we need signals, for example, to control the speeds of the train. We need signals to, for example, if you want to tell a train that, okay, you need to stop, and, all these kind of things. So you want to gain your understanding about the where this solution would be deployed and what problems would be solved because of this signaling system. And this is how you're going to do it. And then moving on to business understanding, you must understand how the system interacts and contribute to overall business goals. As I said earlier, that when we talk about the business context, then we want to, because this whole software or this signaling system project would be done so that it helps the overall business of railways. Okay. So if we think about the systems, about this particular software, this railway signaling system under the systems philosophy, and we think about what are the technological or organizational and what are the business benefits of this, then the business side should tell us that what are the benefits of this system to the overall goals of the organization, because railways do not operation to build this railway signaling system, but this is just a tool that they are going to use so that their operations are smoother, and whatever they are doing, it helps them in achieving that bigger goal. So so one of the key things that we want to achieve is we want to gain a business understanding. And then finally is the understanding the needs and constraints of the system stakeholders, and you must understand as a requirement engineer in detail the specific needs of people who require system support in their work. Now, if you guys remember, in the inception process, we have identified the stakeholders, and we also know that very broadly we also know that what are the main objectives. But now we want to know in detail that when they are going to use it. So, for example, there is an operator who is going to actually use this railway signaling system. Now, when we are in this elicitation process, then we want his point of view. We want to understand how he or she is going to actually use it and what are the features that they would want in it. So, and these things now we want in detail. Okay, so we have seen that elicitation activities are mainly divided into 4 categories. Number 1 is application domain understanding. Okay, number 2 is problem understanding, number 3 is business understanding, and number 4 is understanding the needs and constraints of the end user or the people who are actually going to use this particular product. So before actually moving on to elicitation process techniques, let's briefly discuss what are the problems that people face during elicitation. So the first problem is that the application domain knowledge is not collected neatly in one place. It exists in a variety of different sources, such as in textbooks, operating manuals, and in the hands of the people working in that area. And it usually involves specialist terminology which is not immediately understandable by the requirements engineer. So, for example, let's say I am a software developer and I am a requirement engineer, and I've been told to go and start and understand this application of railway signaling system. And so I would be asked to maybe travel to different places. I would maybe go to the railway headquarters. They would give me some manuals about that what are these signals and why are they used, and they will give me information about the dimension of trains, dimension of tracks, and there are how many tracks. And they might ask me, okay, let's go to such and such area, and we will see how these things work. So one of the biggest problem in gaining this application domain understanding or application domain knowledge is that normally it's not in one place. Okay, so normally these things are not documented in a fashion so that they help a requirement engineer to gain the understanding of the system. So this information, so this knowledge would be explicit, and if this is explicit, it will not be in one place, and it might be implicit. So lots of people would have this knowledge in their heads. So maybe I need to identify those people, that okay, who are the guys who will actually explain me these things, that how this works. So this is the biggest problem, that the knowledge is not in one place, it's distributed. So you have to actually go to different places and to actually develop this application domain knowledge. And the second problem is there are lots of jargon used. If you move from one industry to another industry, there are lots of keywords which are specific to that industry which are used, and they would be used in a different way in another industry. So it will take you time as a requirement engineer to get around it, and it's always a good idea to have people. That's why I said it's always a good idea to have people with you who actually have some domain knowledge. So it's always a good idea to have ask people to come along with you and contact people who are on your side, but they also know the domain as well. So people who understand the problem to be solved are often too busy solving the problem without any new system. And similarly, the second goal was understanding the problem. So normally there are very few people in an organization who know the overall system and who are capable of solving problems. So they are normally very busy and they don't give you time. So this is another problem. And so number one, they cannot spend a lot of time helping requirements engineer understanding the requirements for a new system. and they will not necessarily be convinced of the need for a new system. So may not want to be involved in requirements engineering process. Now this is a very big problem, or very big hurdle when you go and start eliciting requirements from people who are actually part of that system and who are very capable, and they're managing their problems with whatever they have, and they actually think that they already have the solution. Why need a new system? So this is the very big problem, that how do you actually elicit something from them, because they don't believe that you actually need this or that they actually need this particular system. So this is a huge problem, that you want to develop understanding of the problem, but the people who have that understanding, number one is that they're too busy and they don't have enough time to actually give you detailed requirements. And secondly, they actually don't buy your idea of this particular system because they actually think that we don't need it. So this is the second biggest problem. And number three is organizational issues and political factors may influence the system requirements. Higher management may influence the system requirements in ways that satisfy the personal agendas. And this is not the only thing that would happen. I mean, if there are, normally in every organization or bigger organization, there are some political factors and there are some organizational issues. For example, I don't know, four people in the director, or four of the directors, they would want something, whereas three directors say, okay, no, we don't actually need it. And all the people who are in favor of those four directors, they would help you in gathering requirements, but the people who are under influence of the rest of the three directors of a big organization, they might not help you. So and secondly, people would try to influence the software, in a fashion which is actually helpful for them. So it is very important that number one is that, as I said, in project management, what we say is that if top management support is there, then it's one of the key factors towards the successful completion of any software project. So first thing you want is that the main sponsor or the main guy or the main requester of the project should be somebody higher up. If that is the case, then you need to keep that guy in the loop, so that, because people would want things in the software which for their own benefits, okay, and they would want to you to leave some loopholes in the software, or leave some gaps, so that they can do things the way they were doing already. But you need to keep the person who was actually the original requester, you need to keep them in the loop. And stakeholders often don't really know what they want from the computer system, except in most general terms. So this is another big problem, as I gave you the example of a couple of my students who went to a client and he didn't have any clue what he wants in his computer system. He just knew that what's his problem is, and his problem was, so for example, that guy's problem was that he was in a remote location and he had multiple for example rest houses or guest houses, and he wanted to monitor all of them. So sitting in, for example, in another country, he wanted to view what's happening in all these four guest houses or rest houses of his. So that was his problem, but he did not know that how this thing will be implemented as a computer system. So asking him questions, that what do you want in a system, and how you want the system to look like, or what are the features that you wanted, that was useless. All you wanted to know, all you should be asking this particular guy is that how we can facilitate you, what kind of information you want to know about all these stakeholders. So all this guy is interested in saying is that what are his expenses, and what is the income, and how many rooms are filled in, and what is the stock in particular guest house, and all these things. So he would be able to give you information from his perspective, from his knowledge of his business, whereas he will not be very suitable to tell you about that what he actually wants in the computer system. So generally stakeholders are not that knowledgeable, and you would find that this would be the case in lots of bigger corporations in Pakistan. For example, we have been part of the team which implemented lots of ERP systems in different parts of Punjab, for example Sialkot. And so what happened there was that we had lots of people who just wanted software just for the sake of it, and they knew that their competitor has it, so why don't we actually go and have it? And they actually didn't have any clue that what are the possible benefits until before actually it was implemented on their side, they did not actually appreciate the benefit of that particular ERP implementation, or how it will help them. So generally stakeholders, they cannot actually guide you that what are the things that they want in a computer system, because they are not familiar with it. So you have to actually do it on your own. So another thing is that you need to know who are the users of the system, and by knowing the users of the system and their skills, when you are when you're writing or when you're specifying requirements, you need to keep these things in mind, that okay, my end user, they are not very literate, okay, and they cannot manage a screen with too many fancy buttons and too many menus in it. So you want to simplify it as much as you can, so that the software that you're making for somebody, he should be able to use it. If it's too complex, then they are not going to use it. So let's quickly see that where elicitation fits in the overall requirement engineering process. And this is actually a good diagram. It looks like a spiral, and but this is not the spiral model. It's just showing that the requirement engineering tasks or these processes, they are not sequential. So for example, we are doing multiple things at the same time. And so what we are doing is we have started this elicitation process, and as we know that from elicitation we produce this draft or the statements of requirements, and then we do this elaboration, which is analysis, and we identify problems in requirements, then we go and negotiate those requirements, and then we document them again. So basically what we are doing is we complete this one cycle, and then we start eliciting again, and then we start eliciting again, unless and until we have the final list of the requirements. So basically these things are going to go along in parallel. So we'll do some elicitation, we'll do some analysis on it, and after doing analysis, if we find some problems, we'll go back and talk to the client again and resolve those conflicts and document them again. So this will keep on going unless and until we have gained the application domain knowledge, we have understood the problem, we have understood the business context, and we have understood all the stakeholders' constraints and all the services that they would want in the system. So this is a very generic requirement elicitation process, but keep that process definition in your mind, that this is just a representation of this particular process. You can tailor it according to your needs. So the first thing is that you want to establish the objectives, okay, then you want to understand your background, you want to organize your knowledge, and finally you collect requirements. So you have some business goals, you want to understand problem to be solved, and you have some system constraints. So what you do basically is that you gain this information, and you put this in your list of requirements or that you have gathered from the client. But you also use this knowledge in understanding the organizational structure. You use it to understand the application domain. You use it to understand the existing system. And you again, once you have this information, you put it in your list of requirements. You use this, you basically do stakeholder identification with it. You do your prioritization of the different goals that different stakeholders have identified, and you also do your domain knowledge filtering. And you again put that in the list of requirements that you've gathered, and then you basically do ask from the stakeholders that you have further filtered. You basically ask them those specific requirements. You try to understand what are the domain requirements and what are organizational requirements. And so basically, if you try to grasp this whole elicitation process, so there are lots of things which are happening in parallel here. But the key thing is that you want to get the requirements from this elicitation process, and we want to know what are the stakeholder requirements. And in order to do that, we have the business goals, okay, and by identifying those business goals, we can also identify the organizational structure. We can, once we know the organizational structure, we can identify, okay, these are the heads of those different departments. Then we go and talk to those heads, and we start eliciting requirements. Similarly, if we gain our understanding of the problem, what is the problem that needs to be solved, which we already know from the Inception process, we can start understanding the application domain, and from the different goals that we have identified from different stakeholders, we can prioritize those goals, and then we can start gathering particular domain requirements. For example, the railway signaling system, we want to know for how long the signal needs to be active, okay, and why the speed limit need to be 40 there, or we want to know particular things, that how a certain calculation will be done for this railway signaling system, and we want to actually achieve that and by gathering those domain requirements. And similarly, so this is the journal elicitation process, which is broadly divided into 4 different things. We are establishing the objectives, we are understanding the background, we are organizing knowledge, and finally we are collecting the requirements. So now, similarly, there are also some elicitation stages. So what we try to do is that in a stepwise fashion, we because for example, this is the first day I go to a new client, and today is my first day of eliciting requirements. Now I cannot straight away start asking very particular domain requirements. So first of all, I need to establish. So if you look at this requirement engineering process, then you would see that this establishing objective would be the first stage. So this would be the first stage of the requirement elicitation process, because I would do these things when I go in and when I go to a client and for eliciting requirements the very first day. And by building my knowledge about these things, and I would be able to identify some requirements from these this first stage, it would help me to move to the next stage, and by doing the next stage, it will help me move to the further stages. So what are these stages? So the first one is the objective setting. The second one is background knowledge acquisition, and the fourth one is knowledge organization, and finally is stakeholder requirement collection. So keep this thing in mind, that you cannot jump in and start asking very specific questions from stakeholders, because you just had a very brief idea about the stakeholders of the project from inception. Now you want to develop your understanding about the application first, and know what are the objectives in detail before you actually start asking these questions. So what do we do in the first phase? The organizational objectives should be established, including journal goals of the business, and an outline description of the problem to be solved, why the system is necessary, and the constraints on the system. Now, if you guys remember a document that I showed you in one of our lectures on of a project business locator, and if you remember the IEEE template for documenting requirements, then the requirement document it used to build on. So for example, initially we had the introduction, and we used to talk about the product function, then we talked about product perspective, and briefly we talked about scope of the project, and there was, I think, the specific requirement, we started specifying them in chapter 3 and chapter 4. So the key thing that I'm trying to say is that as part of the elicitation process, although we say that the key thing or the key output that we want from the elicitation process are requirements, but we also try to establish the overall objective from the client, because we briefly identified it in the inception process. Now we are going to do it in detail. And what background knowledge acquisition stage is about, background information about the system includes information about the organization where the system is to be installed, the application domain of the system, and information about existing systems. Why the background knowledge is important? Because you want to know what are the current practices of the organization and what problems they are facing from their current practices, because this is actually how you are going to sell the system to the stakeholders. Remember that one of the problems in requirement elicitation process that we discussed was that that the people who have knowledge about the system, they are not going to, they don't actually buy into this idea of developing a new system, because they actually think that they don't need it because they already have the solution. So if you are able to identify the problems with the current system and how this current process is inefficient, you can use these things to actually start asking very specific questions. So you can see that in a stepwise fashion, we are getting more information about this particular product that we are going to build. And then knowledge organization. The large amount of knowledge which has been collected in the previous stages must be organized and collected. So we have gathered lots of information in those two previous phases, for example in objective setting and in background knowledge acquisition. Now we need to organize it. And why this organization is important? Because in the final stage of requirement elicitation, we are going to ask very specific questions from different stakeholders. So we need this proper organization. So let's go and quickly see our process again. So when we say we establish objectives, so this is our first stage. So we have identified the business goals, we have identified what problem needs to be solved, and we have identified broad system constraints. And this has given us some information about. This information is actually more than what we had in inception, but it's not all what we want. And so based on these initial knowledge about the system, we are going to develop our understanding about the background. So what are the current system in the organization, what are their current processes, what are the problem with the current systems, and why this information is useful. Because by doing these things, by understanding the knowledge, by understanding those different processes, we would be able to identify what are the people, what are the actors involved in those processes. So we have knowledge of the processes, now we have knowledge about the overall objective of the system. Now we want to organize this knowledge. We want to say, okay, these are the stakeholders of this particular system, these are the goals, and this is how we think they are prioritizing them, and this is the domain knowledge that we have gathered, and we also want to filter that knowledge. And then comes the final stage where we basically start asking very specific questions from our stakeholders, and those questions not only include how the end user would want to use a particular system, but it would also include domain specific questions. So elicitation is a stepwise process, and in each stage we gain more knowledge, and we organize ourselves to finally ask the specific questions from the stakeholders. So once we have this list of requirements, then let's briefly look at how analysis and negotiation, they play their part in finally getting a list of requirements that we actually want to specify. Briefly, when we say we want to analyze requirements, then there are three things that we want to achieve. We want to only have set of requirements which are necessary. So we want to have necessity checking in the analysis phase. We also want to evaluate that which requirements are consistent and which are complete. Similarly, we also want to know that which requirements are feasible. By feasibility, we mean which are achievable things in the limited resources that we have to develop this particular. So when we do these three things in the analysis phase, what we get is that we basically get three sort of outputs. We identify unnecessary requirements, we identify incomplete and inconsistent requirements, we also identify unfeasible requirements or infeasible requirements. Then comes the negotiation process, and what we do in negotiation process is we try to prioritize requirements, we try to have an agreement on the requirements, and we finally have some discussion. Through discussion we prioritize, and we want to achieve, we want to have an agreement or consensus on the overall requirements. So although we are going to talk about this analysis and negotiation, but I just wanted to let you guys know that once we have elicited requirements, then this elicitation process is very complex, and I think it's one of the key processes, because if we are not able to target one key stakeholder in the system, for example, then we are going to miss those key features that those key processes that the stakeholder is involved in. And if we have missed him in eliciting requirements, then we have missed a very important portion. So if elicitation is not properly completed, then analysis and negotiation, they cannot be very beneficial. Okay. And secondly, this elicitation, as a result of this elicitation process, we might produce lots of garbage as well. We might produce lots of inconsistent, incomplete, infeasible requirements. So analysis is very important, and in analysis we mainly do these three things: feasibility checking, consistency checking, and necessity checking. And similarly, when we do these things, then comes the negotiation process, which actually deals with those inconsistent, infeasible, or incomplete or unnecessary requirements. So let's briefly see what we do in necessity checking. The need for the requirement is analyzed. In some cases, requirements may be proposed which do not contribute to the business goals of the organization or to specific problem to be addressed by the system. So this is very important, and as I said, the different stakeholders would tell you there would be lots of stakeholders' wishes. Okay, and those wishes might be very expensive, and in order for you to include them in the final software, you might have to deploy lots of resources and lots of time might be invested. So you want to identify that whether this particular requirement is necessary for the overall objective or overall goal of the organization. Similarly, in consistency and completeness checking, the requirements are cross-checked for consistency and completeness. Okay. So as I said that we have discussed this example already, that in a registration process, students and the administration, they might give you conflicting requirements. So you need to identify if there are any conflicting requirements that you have gathered, because you want to resolve those conflicts. And consistency means that no requirement should be contradictory, Completeness means that no services or constraints which are needed have been missed out. So completeness is very important. And then finally, feasibility checking. What does it do? The requirements are checked to ensure that they are feasible in the context of the budget and schedule available for the system development. This is not the analysis process. These are just the analysis checks that we do once we have elicited requirements. So after elicitation, we would always do this necessity checking. We will always check the requirements for consistency and completeness. We will also check the requirements for feasibility. And as a result of this, we will do some negotiation. We'll do requirement discussion. And what we do here is that the requirements which have been highlighted as problematical are discussed, and the stakeholders involved present their views about the requirements. And requirement prioritization. Disputed requirements are prioritized to identify critical requirements and to help the decision-making process. Requirements agreement. Solution to the requirement problems are identified and a compromise set of requirements are agreed. Generally, this will involve making changes to some of the requirements. So because I have said you that requirement elicitation is a very crude process. Why I say it? Because no matter how efficient or how organized you are in eliciting requirements, the process entails in itself, this ambiguity, this inconsistency, and it has contradiction in its own definition, because you're going to elicit requirements from the end users, and different end users have their own perspective about the system, and they are going to tell you things which are contradictory to each other. So as a requirement engineer, it's your job to actually identify those problematical requirements, and it's your job to negotiate with the client. There is another requirement prioritization stage, which we do once we have the final list of requirements, and that is done from the software engineer or software development point of view, that we also want to prioritize requirements from the development. We want to identify that which requirements we need to build first. So that is another requirement prioritization, but here prioritization means that from those problematical requirements that you have identified, you want to prioritize those critical things which need to be fixed first, so that you can efficiently resolve those conflicts, those inconsistencies, and have a final set of requirements. So I think that's it from today's lecture, and let's quickly see what we have done in today's class. We started our discussion on the inception process, and before we actually got to it, we briefly defined that what is a process. And always keep this thing in mind, that a process is nothing more than a set of activities, and all these activities, what they do is that they are going to consume something, and then they are going to produce something. And when we say that they're going to produce something, that they can produce some work products which are inputs to some other activities, and they produce some more work products which are then finally producing something, and they can be input to another activity which are going to produce some outputs. So a process has is a set of activities which we do in order to achieve a certain goal. Okay. And this was our general definition of a process. And another thing which I think I missed in my definition of process was that normally these activities or these tasks, they are conducted by different stakeholders. So there are people who are involved in who would be assigned to those. For example, one of the elicitation process activity that we saw in today's lecture was gaining application domain or understanding the business context, or understanding the problem. Those were the different activities. Now, as a group of people who go to elicit requirements, then those different tasks would be assigned to different people. And or one task may be assigned to multiple people. For example, we said that application domain knowledge might not be in one place, so you would have different people, and you would send them to different places to gather that gather that application domain understanding. So normally a process is a set of activities which we do in order to achieve a certain goal. And what's an activity? It produces something, and in order to produce that particular work product or produce that output, it consumes something. And specifically we looked at the elicitation process. We saw what are the different components of the elicitation process. We saw what are the different activities involved in the elicitation process, and we saw different stages of the elicitation process. And we said that initially we have this objective stage, and after this objective stage we have in the objective stage we try to come up with what are the main goals of the system, and then we understand the current problem. This is very important, that we develop our understanding of the current practices or current processes, and then what we do is we basically organize this knowledge that we have done in those previous two stages. And when we say we organize our knowledge, because we have gathered so much information, we want to identify who are the key stakeholders, what application domain things we have gathered, and on the basis of this then comes the final stage where we collect stakeholder requirements. So this was the requirement engineering stages, and the reason we say that it is decomposed into these stages is that in each stage we gather some knowledge which is helpful for us to move to the next stage and finally get the list of the requirements. And towards the end of the lecture we also talked about that that requirement elicitation process, by definition it would give you some contradictory, some problematical requirements. So you do some kind of analysis checking, and you perform some negotiation even in the elicitation process to get those final set of requirements, because in the end you want complete, consistent, feasible and necessary requirements as an output from this elicitation process. So that's it from today's lecture. Inshallah, in the next lecture we'll continue our discussion on this elicitation process, and we'll move to some elicitation techniques. Allah Hafiz.